Jericho, the 9th century before Christ. A city is dying. The water is bad, the land is barren, and the people are desperate. A prophet walks to the center of town. He does not bring a rare herb. He does not perform a complex ritual. He asks for a new bowl, fills it with the most common thing in their kitchens, and throws it into the spring. And the water heals. It heals instantly. But here is what the official version does not tell you. That was not a miracle of chemistry. That was a legal transaction. And what happened in that water is the exact same thing happening in your bedroom while you sleep. Before we continue, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. This is very important for the algorithm to understand that this kind of content has value, and it is what allows me to keep opening archives that very few channels have the courage to open, bringing you these discoveries that have been erased from the textbooks. Someone wrote to me last month. They said, "Emeka, I do everything right. I work 2 jobs. I pray. I tithe. And I still wake up broke. I keep waking up more tired than when I went to bed. Is something happening while I sleep?" I have been sitting with this for weeks because I know that feeling. I have seen that exact exhaustion. You go to sleep hoping for rest, and you wake up feeling like you just fought a war you cannot remember. Your finances feel cursed. Bills appear out of nowhere. Opportunities fall through at the last second, always right after you finally feel hopeful. You start having these dreams where you are picking up coins off the floor, or your wallet is missing, or you are handing money to someone you do not recognize. People online call this spiritual warfare against your finances. They say your breakthrough is being decided while you are unconscious. But how are you supposed to stay spiritually alert for 8 hours when you are literally asleep? I grew up in Nsukka in eastern Nigeria. My mother was a devout Catholic. She went to Mass, she prayed the rosary. But at night, before we went to sleep, she would do something else. She would take a handful of coarse salt from the kitchen. She would walk to the corners of our rooms, to the door frames, and to the space right under our beds. She would sprinkle the salt there, silently, moving her lips in a prayer I could never quite hear. She never called it a ritual. If my father, a British academic and a historian of ancient religions at University College London, had seen her, he would have called it superstition. He would have sighed and muttered something about pagan remnants. But she did it anyway. Every single night, she knew something he did not. She knew that the night is not a time of rest. The night is an open door. For years, I believed my father. I thought the salt was just folk magic, a comforting psychological crutch for a woman trying to protect her children in an unpredictable world. I went to London. I studied ancient Near Eastern languages at the School of Oriental and African Studies. I learned to read Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic. I spent 12 years researching manuscripts across Ethiopia, Israel, Egypt, and the United Kingdom. I became a man of evidence, of texts, of verifiable historical facts. I wanted to understand the mechanics of the ancient mind. I wanted to see the primary sources, the original documents, the untranslated papyri that shaped the foundations of our modern beliefs. I spent thousands of hours in sterile reading rooms, wearing white cotton gloves, turning pages that had not been turned in centuries. I was looking for the truth behind the myths. I was looking for the historical reality that had been buried under layers of institutional theology. And then I found myself in the basement archives of the British Museum. Tuesday, the 14th of October, 2014. The air was dry, climate controlled to protect the fragile papyri. I was translating a catalog of ancient protective rites, looking at a fragmentary text from the 1st century. The ink was faded, the parchment was brittle, but the words were clear. And there it was. The exact practice my mother used in Nsukka, documented 2,000 years ago. Not as folk magic, not as a pagan superstition, but as a formal, recognized mechanism of spiritual defense. That was the moment I knew the ancient world had secrets we had barely scratched. I stared at the manuscript for what felt like hours. The translation was undeniable. The text described placing salt at the threshold and in the corners of the sleeping quarters to ward off nocturnal spiritual intrusions. It was the same gesture, the same substance, the same purpose. My mother, thousands of miles away, separated by millennia of history, was performing an ancient, documented rite. She had not invented it. She had inherited it. What most people miss is that salt is not just seasoning. In the modern world, salt is cheap. It is on every table in every diner. We take it for granted. We buy it in plastic containers for a few cents. But in the ancient world, salt was power. Let me show you what the texts actually say. Open the book of Leviticus, chapter 2, verse 13. The text mandates that every single offering made in the temple must be accompanied by salt. It is called the covenant of salt. Why? Because salt does not corrupt. It preserves. It is indestructible. When God wanted to establish a pact that could never be broken, He did not use gold. He did not use iron. He used salt. The salt was the physical seal of an eternal, unbreakable, legal agreement. The priests in the temple didn't use salt to make the meat taste better. They used it to legally bind the offering to the altar. The salt transformed a temporary sacrifice into a permanent covenant. Now think about this carefully. If salt is the seal of an unbreakable covenant, what happens when you introduce it into a space of vulnerability? What happens when you place it where you sleep? The night is when your conscious mind shuts down. Your defenses are lowered. Your physical body is paralyzed in REM sleep. You are completely exposed. In the ancient understanding, the night was when the spiritual boundaries were thinnest. It was when the forces of decay, of theft, of corruption had the easiest access to your life. If you do not have a seal on your sleeping space, you are leaving the door wide open. Let us go back to Jericho. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 19 through 22. Elisha the prophet is facing a crisis of barrenness. The water is bad, the land is aborting its fruit, absolute economic and physical desolation. The people are starving, the city is dying. Does he pray a long, complicated prayer? No. He demands a new bowl. He puts salt in it. He walks to the source of the water. He throws the salt into the spring and speaks a specific declaration. Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. The barrenness stops instantly. He did not use an exotic ingredient. He used kitchen salt, but he paired it with a declaration of authority. The salt was the point of contact. The word was the power. He established a covenant of healing at the very source of the city's life. But here is where the story turns. Why is this connected to your money? Why does this specific element protect your finances while you sleep? We have to look at the historical evidence. We have to look at how wealth was actually measured and protected in the ancient world. To understand that, you have to look at the Roman Empire. The Romans understood the power of salt better than anyone. They did not just use it for food. They used it as currency. They built an entire highway, the Via Salaria, just to transport salt from the coast to Rome. Controlling the salt trade was how Rome built its wealth. And the soldiers who guarded that road, the legionaries who enforced the power of the empire, were paid a specific allowance to buy their salt. In Latin, it was called the salarium argentum, the salt money. That is where we get the English word salary. Your salary, your income, your financial livelihood is etymologically and historically tied to salt. The very concept of earning a living is rooted in this indestructible mineral. The connection between salt, preservation, and wealth is not a modern coincidence. It is an ancient reality. When your finances are under attack, when your salary seems to vanish into thin air, you are experiencing a decay, a corruption of your labor. You work hard all day, you earn your salary, but it slips through your fingers like water. Bills appear exactly when you have a surplus. The car breaks down the day after you get a bonus. That is not just bad luck. In the ancient framework, that is a spiritual leak. That is a targeted attack on the preservation of your wealth. And what is the ancient, biblically mandated antidote to corruption? The covenant of salt. I know what the skeptics say. I used to be one of them. My father was one of them. They say a Mecca. Salt is just sodium chloride. Treating it as a spiritual instrument is superstition dressed up as faith. If a ritual this simple actually worked, everyone who did it would already be rich. This is just folk magic wearing a Christian mask. It is a psychological trick for desperate people. I have heard all the arguments. I have made all those arguments myself in seminar rooms in London. But here is what the records show. The records are stubborn things. They do not care about our modern sensibilities. The practice of placing salt in the corners of a home, especially near the bed, is deeply documented within the strictest rabbinic traditions. Read the Talmud. Read the Zohar. These are not books of witchcraft. These are the foundational texts of Jewish law and mysticism. The Talmud compares the table in a home to an altar, which is why bread is never broken without salt. The Zohar teaches that salt sweetens the severe judgments, containing and neutralizing harsh spiritual forces. Up until the Middle Ages, Ashkenazic Jews placed salt in the corners of rooms and on the threshold of doors, specifically as protection against demonic intrusion. This is documented history. It did not come from witchcraft. It came from ancient, formal religious practice. The folklore only borrowed it centuries later. The institutional church might have forgotten it or suppressed it, but the texts remember. Even the prophet Ezekiel knew this. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 4, he describes a newborn child who was abandoned. And what is the mark of that abandonment? The text says the child was not rubbed with salt. In the ancient Near East, rubbing a newborn with salt was the standard practice for protection, purification, and formal dedication of a new life. It was not a medical procedure. It was a spiritual sealing. The absence of salt meant the child was completely defenseless. The child was exposed to every hostile force in the environment. When you go to sleep without sealing your space, you are like that newborn, defenseless. You are leaving your most vulnerable hours wide open to the exact forces that want to drain your peace and your prosperity. You are sleeping on a battlefield without armor. You are letting the forces of decay operate in your life while you are unconscious. And you wake up exhausted because your spirit has been fighting a defensive war all night while your body was paralyzed. 3 people knew the depth of this mystery in my family. My mother, who practiced it silently in the humid nights of Nsuka. My grandmother, who warned us about what walks at night, telling stories by the light of a kerosene lamp. And now, me, reading the translation of a first-century manuscript in the sterile fluorescent light of a London museum, realizing that the illiterate women of my lineage possessed an exact theological science that the academics had dismissed. I had traveled across the world, learned dead languages, and spent years in dusty archives, only to discover that the most profound spiritual technology was sitting in a small ceramic bowl on my mother's kitchen counter. The deeper you dig into these records, the more you realize that the ancient world operated on a very different understanding of what is real. For them, the spiritual and the physical were not 2 separate realms. They were 2 sides of the same coin. An attack on your finances was not just an economic problem. It was a spiritual manifestation, and the defense had to operate on both levels. That is why they use salt. It is a physical substance that carries a spiritual weight. I remember another night in Nsuka, right after a particularly difficult financial season for our family. My mother had lost some money in a market transaction, a significant amount. Instead of panicking, she waited until the house was quiet. She took her salt, and she went to every window, every door, every corner of the house. I watched her from the hallway. She was not acting out of fear. She was acting with the calm precision of a soldier setting a perimeter. The next morning, a relative who owed us money for years suddenly appeared at our door with the exact amount she had lost. Coincidence? My father would say yes. The text from the British Museum says no. The archives in Israel reveal the same phenomenon. During my time in Jerusalem, I examined fragments of the Sefer Raziel Hamalach. The texts explicitly warn about nocturnal entities that feed on the anxiety and the unsealed labor of human beings. They describe these forces as parasites of prosperity. And the prescribed defense, the barrier they cannot cross, is the covenant of salt. The salt creates a boundary of purity that corruption cannot penetrate. You have to understand the scale of what is happening. We are living in a time of unprecedented financial anxiety. People are working harder than ever, and yet the feeling of insecurity only grows. This is not just a failure of economics, it is a failure of spiritual defense. We have abandoned the ancient perimeters. We go to sleep with our minds full of worry, our doors spiritually wide open, practically inviting the forces of decay to take what they want. And they do. They take our peace, they take our rest, and slowly they erode our prosperity. But you have the power to stop it. You do not need a degree in ancient languages. You do not need access to the restricted archives of the British Museum. The technology is already in your home. The salt is waiting in your kitchen. The words of authority are waiting in your mouth. You simply have to connect them. When you place the salt under your bed tonight, you are not performing magic. You are participating in a legal reality that has been recognized by heaven and earth for thousands of years. You are invoking the indestructible nature of the covenant. You are aligning your home, your rest, and your finances with the ancient incorruptible power that healed the waters of Jericho. You are drawing a line in the sand that the forces of decay cannot cross. The official version tells you that your financial struggles are just bad luck. The official version tells you that waking up exhausted is just stress, or a bad mattress, or too much caffeine. But the evidence points to something else. The evidence shows that there is a deliberate, targeted drain happening in the spiritual realm during the hours you are unconscious. The ancient world knew this. They did not pretend the night was safe. They knew it was a time of transition, a time when the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were porous. They knew that if you wanted to protect your family, your health, and your wealth, you had to establish a perimeter. So what do? You do what Elisha did. You do not just throw salt under your bed and hope for the best. The salt alone is just a mineral. It only becomes a seal when it is activated by a declaration. Elisha did not just toss the salt into the spring in silence. He spoke the word of authority. He commanded the healing. Tonight, before you go to sleep, you take a small amount of salt. It does not have to be a new bowl, but it must be intentional. You place it under your bed or in the corners of your room, and you speak. You do not whisper timidly. You declare that your home, your rest, and your labor are under the covenant of preservation. You speak against the draining forces. You establish the boundary. You use the ordinary to command the extraordinary. You tell the forces of corruption that this house is sealed. The text was not revealed. It was constructed to hide this power. The institutions took these simple, potent acts of faith and buried them under layers of dogma and complex liturgy. They made you think you needed a priest, a specialized building, and a donation to access spiritual protection. But the truth survived. The simple physical acts of faith have always carried the most weight. The power was never in the institution. It was always in the covenant. We can see this same pattern repeated across centuries. When I was in Ethiopia, in the high mountains of Lalibela, I sat with priests of the Orthodox Tewahedo Church. These men guard some of the oldest Christian traditions on earth. untouched by Western revisions? They do exactly the same thing. They do not bless a house with just water. They mix it with salt. They know the theology of the incorruptible seal, and when you ask them why, they do not point to a medieval superstition. They point straight back to Leviticus. They point to the eternal covenant. This unbroken thread of knowledge connects the temple in Jerusalem, the springs of Jericho, the monasteries of Ethiopia, and my mother's small house in eastern Nigeria. It is a universal spiritual technology that we have been conditioned to forget. And that conditioning was not an accident. Look at how quickly modern society dismisses anything it cannot patent, package, and sell. We are taught to manage our finances with spreadsheets and our exhaustion with energy drinks. But the anxiety remains. The drain continues. You can balance your budget perfectly, but if there is a spiritual leak in your life, the math will never work in your favor. You are trying to solve a spiritual robbery with a calculator. It is like trying to fix a broken window by turning up the heating. You are addressing the symptom, not the breach. The covenant of salt addresses the breach. It seals the window. It tells the forces operating in the dark that this specific territory is claimed, protected, and off limits. Think about the structure of your own life. Think about the moments when everything seemed to be falling apart, when the exhaustion was so heavy you could barely move. How much of that was physical, and how much of it was spiritual? The ancient texts do not make a distinction. They view the human being as an integrated whole. If your spirit is under attack while you sleep, your physical body will wake up exhausted, and your physical resources, your money, your opportunities will begin to dry up. It is a chain reaction. And the salt is the circuit breaker. In the Egyptian archives, I found Coptic manuscripts detailing the lives of the Desert Fathers. These were men who went into the absolute isolation of the wilderness to face the spiritual realities head-on. And what did they use to protect their small cells at night? They used salt. They understood that the desert was full of wandering forces, entities that sought to drain the vitality of the living. The salt was their primary defense. They did not have access to complex liturgical instruments. They had sand, water, and salt, and they knew that the salt was the anchor of the covenant. Why do we think we are any different? We live in concrete cities instead of the desert, but the spiritual realities have not changed. The forces of decay are still operating. They have just adapted to the modern world. They attack our bank accounts, our careers, our peace of mind. And our modern sophistication has left us completely defenseless. We have unlearned the ancient ways of protection. I have seen people try to fix this with sheer willpower. They take a second job. They drink more coffee. They set their alarms earlier. But you cannot outwork a spiritual leak. If there is a hole in the bucket, pouring water in faster will not solve the problem. The covenant of salt is what plugs the hole. It is the ancient, biblically validated mechanism for sealing your labor and your rest. It is not an alternative to hard work. It is the protection of it. When Elisha healed the waters of Jericho, he did not just throw the salt and walk away. He spoke with the authority of the covenant. That is the missing piece for so many people. They treat the salt like a magic charm, hoping it will do the work for them. But the salt is just the physical anchor. Your declaration is what activates it. The spiritual realm responds to authority, and authority is established through the spoken word. When you declare that your space is sealed, you are enforcing the boundary. My father's academic colleagues used to debate the meaning of Elisha's miracle at Jericho. They would write long, complex papers about the metaphorical significance of the salt. They treated the text as literature. But they completely missed the point. It was not a metaphor, it was a manual. Elisha was demonstrating a principle of spiritual mechanics. He was showing us how to reverse barrenness and decay. He was showing us how to use the physical to command the spiritual. This is the great secret of the ancient world. The extraordinary is hidden in the ordinary. The most powerful spiritual tools are not rare or expensive. They are common. They are accessible. The only thing that makes them powerful is the authority with which they are used. The salt on your table is just salt. But the salt under your bed, placed with intention and sealed with a declaration, becomes an impenetrable barrier. So I urge you to look at your life. Look at the patterns of exhaustion and financial drain. If you are tired of waking up feeling like you are losing a battle you cannot see, then it is time to change the rules of engagement. It is time to use the tools that the ancients used. It is time to establish the covenant of salt in your own home. Do not let another night pass without sealing your space. Do not continue to operate under the assumption that your exhaustion is normal or that your financial struggles are purely mathematical. The evidence from antiquity is staring us in the face. It tells us that we have been fighting a two-front war with only half of our armor. I spent 12 years in the archives to realize that the most profound spiritual technology was not locked away in a museum, but sitting in a kitchen cabinet, waiting to be used with the right authority. Reclaim your rest, reclaim your labor, reclaim the hours you spend in the dark. Establish the covenant tonight. Speak the declaration over your home, over your family, over the resources you have worked so hard to gather, and watch what happens in the morning. When the perimeter is sealed, the drain stops. And when the drain stops, true prosperity can finally take root. What you do with this is up to you. You can listen to this and go to sleep exactly as you did last night. You can wake up tomorrow feeling just as exhausted, just as drained, wondering why your hard work never translates into lasting wealth. Or you can test the ancient evidence. I have seen the texts. I have seen the change in my own life. I have seen the absolute shift in the atmosphere of a home when the covenant of salt is established. Do this tonight. Seal your rest. Take back the hours you spend unconscious. If this investigation brought you value, if it opened a door you did not know was there, consider using the Super Thanks button below the video. You're not just a viewer. You are an ally in this research. Your support is what allows me to spend weeks digging through these archives, bypassing the gatekeepers, and bringing this suppressed knowledge directly to you. It takes time, resources, and courage to challenge the narrative. The academic world does not fund this kind of research. The religious institutions certainly do not want it broadcast. When you support the channel, you are directly funding the next discovery. You are helping me uncover the pages they tried to burn. I want to know your thoughts. Have you ever woken up feeling like you fought a battle in your sleep? Have your finances ever felt deliberately attacked right when things were looking up, as if something was intentionally sabotaging your progress? Tell me your experience in the comments. I read them. I see the patterns. Write the word covenant if you are sealing your room tonight. Let it be a public declaration of your intention. Sleep well tonight, or do not. But do not sleep unprotected. The night is no longer an open door. We will go deeper next time.